the initial starting point that I want to focus on today is around this issue of strategy, first of all, and it's the idea, are you actually working to any strategy? And that's not just personally in the context of you and your team that you might be involved in, but what is the strategy? Is there a strategy in your club that you as a coach are working towards? Are you all aligned? Are all the teams and coaches aligned to some degrees? Because I suspect that's actually, from my experience, that is something that isn't always very evident. And this is where we get, particularly when we get to age groups where players, and particularly the stronger players, are being pulled and dragged from because every team wants them. That's where, you know, the idea of the bigger picture and the bigger strategy is really important. And then, I suppose, and I think some of that talks to some of the presentations that you'll have heard last night and today in terms of some of those issues around that. And then going on to looking at issues around the idea of the star. And I'll be pulling a lot of my talk really is first and foremost coming from my own research and organizational level research into talent and talent management in organizations. But there are an awful lot of dovetails. It's very clear. I'm going to talk through maybe some of the challenges and issues around the idea of overly focusing on stars. I think, you know, a key point comes that back to what is the star, what is talent, is very important because it is a very, very loaded term. And in terms of when do we start cutting players? And it's, you know, that is a really important aspect, and I think, and hopefully I'll show that in the context of the GA, how actually, to some degree, a lot of that is very much against the ethos, the mission, and the vision of the GA. So I'm going to start with a statement that I think, if anybody was here last night, I think really does talk to the last speaker last night from Brian Kirkwood about talent is an overused, misused, and abused word. Why do I say that? It's in back to the idea is that it can mean anything and it can mean nothing. And we don't really have that clarity often when we talk about, oh, this person has great potential, they're a star. In terms of what are we making that observation based on? You know, is it based on because they have it? That's not really sufficient. And of course, really what the key point is there's a multitude of ingredients that make a player very effective and be a very strong performer. But also the problem, I think this is a real challenge, when we're very much short-term in focus, the good player today doesn't necessarily be the good player tomorrow. And I don't mean that in the literal sense of the word, but, you know, the really strong under 12, 14, 16 minor player isn't necessarily your inter-county player of tomorrow. And that's because sometimes the ingredients that are really important at different points in time can have a greater impact on performance. And I thought last night it was really well done in the context of, you know, the importance, for example, of size, strength at an underage level. If you're a big, strong, strapping lad with any little bit of skills and ability, you can be the standout performer in the team. But that may not, which by association mean you start building teams around and giving greater opportunities to those sort of players, which may mean that actually that some of the players who have the greater long-term ability may drop off. And I think it's very interesting. There seems to be a little bit of actual very specific evidence coming in the GA circles about that, you know, an age-relative type effect. I think that's really important. So I think, you know, a key point from this is the need to look at what we actually view by talent and understanding when we're making decisions that we're future-oriented. And I think that is a key point that I think gets lost a lot of the time. Is that, you know, the idea even of the name of this conference, the GA Games Development. Development, the key word. Development is future-orientated. Just like in a work and a training setting, development is future-orientated. It's not necessarily about the short term. I think, you know, we do have to work about that, and I think, you know, we have to be conscious and careful of decisions that we start making, particularly, you know, as we move into greater use of academies, which are still, I think initially are very much modeled off professional sports to some degree, and I think there is the need to question some of that to some degree in terms of how we do that, in terms of at what ages and how much inclusion and exclusion should happen at different ages. And it's about ensuring that we look at those sort of things, because the fact of the matter is, you know, when we talk about at the moment, you know, and I would have played for at underage level we would have played on the divisional teams that would have been in, you know, at Munster competitions at times at under 16. And there's very marginal calls between who makes some of those squads at times, you know, and who makes them at times. It is a mix of people who are performing very well. There's also been a mix of the club and you being in the shop window. There's obviously the mix of power and politics that all get into it. And you know, those borderline cases of who have clearly a strong player and aren't making it into that academy or into that higher level team, there's a great chance that that breeds serious discontentment and actually disengages them. So if a person isn't making some of these teams, it's back to this important idea of how do we deal with that and how do we help those individuals process the fact that they haven't made it at this point in time, but that's not a fatal point. And it is bringing back to a lot of key points that have been made throughout the conference so far about the importance of the social side, the psychosocial type side of things in terms of actually that engagement with players. So really, you know, in a business world, and I think this applies to any successful organization, is the importance of strategy. And I'll say straight out, the idea of put strategy, not people first. Now that's not some nasty connotation. It really is the idea that you need to understand where you're going before you can get there. So essentially what is, and I think it does tie into a presentation here this morning, but you know, understanding what you are trying to do. And actually making it clear to people what you are actually trying to achieve. You know, don't believe that people understand your intentions. You know, and as editor of a journal, it's a key point of feedback that often we go back to writers that are trying to get published in our journal about. You try and you don't let all of the interpretation on the reader. You try to reduce the amount of interpretation that you're giving the reader rather than the other way around. You tell the reader what you want them to believe, what you want them to actually read from. What is the point you're trying to get across? I think you have to have clarity of that if you're really going to actually engage in that. So I think that is a really important point. You know, so again, you know, you have the strategy in place, and then you start looking at it in an organizational sense about, well, what are the structures, the systems, the support networks, the processes, the procedures that we need to start putting in place to help us realize that strategy? And also then, what are the types of people? And this is back to this point, you know, is the focus, you know, where is the focus if you're an under-12 coach? Is it about winning the under-12 county title? Or is it about actually developing that player to go on? Yes, of course you might want to win, but that's a byproduct. So the importance of the process, but it's tied into a bigger picture. So is the strategy actually that you're working towards as a club is that you want to bring players through. You want to develop players to be the best they are. You want to keep their participation. You know, that was a point that was mentioned just at the keynote just gone with Peter Canavan and Peter Keane and Stephen McDonnell. You know, in terms of that idea of keeping participation going as well is very important. So I think, you know, a key point about it is, does your club have a strategy? Are you aware of it? Are you operating to that? Is there a commonality of purpose in terms of what you're actually trying to do? So that brings into this idea, is a sole focus on winning appropriate? I'm not asking you to answer these questions, but I don't believe that is the case. Particularly, you know, a lot of the coaches here today, which I suppose I am also trying to speak towards, are those that, you know, that are probably at the early stages of coaching or at earlier levels in their coaching development, are looking after juvenile and underage teams. A sole focus on winning is very dangerous because ultimately, one team wins. And I think it's the same. You know, there's so much talk about the Mayo senior footballers in terms of, geez, will they ever get there and so forth, and it's almost deemed that they've been failures. We don't look at it in terms of that they're constantly coming, they keep going back to the well. And again, back to a point that was said, I'm sure when time comes and you start to reflect back, and I think even myself, what do you remember? It's the relationships, it's the actual process, the tough nights of training, the good times. Yes, ultimately you like to get that success, but you're not actually judged by, ultimately always by that in a sporting sphere, particularly in a GAA sporting sense. Because again, look, and we'll come to that in a minute. So again, I say that into the idea of, you know, is the aim as an under 12 or an under 14 coach, and the goal being to win that local title or that county title, or is it actually about trying to improve individuals the best that they can be? And what should that be? And then I raise that point about, is there joined up thinking across teams within that club? So, you know, if you're, you know, does the under, you know, and I think that challenges back to, you know, there's an awful lot of talk now about player burnout. And to be honest, I think that's still an awful lot of rhetoric as opposed to really taking it truly serious. And we're getting into the real season where it's going to become very evident in terms of those players that are at Fitzgibbon and Sigerson level and the pulling and dragging for the pre-season competitions and who's sharing what. But that's going on at underage levels, particularly in clubs that are struggling for numbers. I mean, again, this idea of thinking, what is the ultimate purpose of that player? So, the pulling and dragging and players potentially playing too much and potentially coming disenfranchised from being dragged and pulled and playing too much. If they stop playing at 18, 19, 20 years of age, which is really a major drop-off period, which is why, I think there's an attempt to try and deal with some of those issues in the GAA, is that becomes a problem because your long-term vision and strategy of the GAA is not then occurring. So I think, clarity and purpose of what people are actually working towards. And again, it's back to, that's all well and good saying, but if you're getting a job and the focus has been given, you've been given that job and the focus that you're trying to win, well, that becomes problematic. So I think it is back to the need for these wider level discussions about where do people sit in the system as coaches. When I was looking and thinking about this talk, I said, I'm just going to have a look at what the GAA is about again, in terms of what is actually written down. And what I've put up is the mission of the GAA, taken from the website. And there's various passages that are highlighted there. And they're highlighted for a very particular reason. And it's back to the idea of inclusion. And back to the idea that it's not all about winning and it's not all about the elite. And I think it's a very clear statement that that is the case. So just to pick out some of the key words there, our members, our families, our communities, we serve all, reach out to all and include all members of our society, and then very importantly, enable all our members to achieve their full potential. Which really does suggest the idea that the focus very much needs to be on is actually improving each individual. And of course, when we start talking in the ideas of talent and talent management, talent inevitably means comparison. So we compare a player against another player. And that's not always helpful. Yes, of course we have to do it, and it's human nature to do comparison, but at different stages I think it becomes more or less appropriate. And particularly at underage levels, is that some of those comparisons are potentially cutting people from achieving their full potential. So the importance of actually potentially looking at who here provides individual focused development plans for players at any level, in terms of what are the key strengths that a particular individual possesses that you get them to work on, and identifying some of the areas that perhaps they can improve that they're not particularly strong in. We do tend to overemphasize weaknesses, but actually maybe focusing on strengths is a better approach as well. And similarly, the GAA vision statement, again, unsurprisingly speaks to, and I think the real important term here is lifelong engagement with our association. So I think we do have to be very conscious. I think there was evidence came out during the week from the CSO about just participation in sport in this country widely, and it's concerning, I think. And we have to look at that in terms of where do we fit into this. Many of you might reflect back to this and remember it from your Leaving Cert days in English, comes from Animal Farm. And it's a term that I often use with speaking to senior organisation people. And again, when we talk about talent management, which is now, essentially you look at any studies of management and organisational pressures, talent management is typically in the top 5 stated issues and concerns and risks for business senior organisation leaders are concerned about. And that's the idea of talent management in organisation life is very much about focusing on the top echelon positions and about exclusivity. It is about the cream of the crop. And I spend a lot of time looking into how, again, do you actually select the right people, the right type of people that have the potential to take on those roles and have that competition. Because there is people that contribute more than others in organizations. There are employees that are more important than others. So the addition of certain employees into an organization can exponentially increase the productivity and competitive advantage of that organization. And equally, the departure of certain individuals from that organization can create a major decline in the success of that organization. But how applicable is that to this context is a question. I think it's back to looking again. There is a counterpoint that a lot of organizations also offer and engage in, is a more inclusive view of talent management, where again it is focusing on maximizing the impact of each individual to achieve their potential. And of course, the problem is we typically often talk about two counterpoints, both extremes, when realistically it's about somewhere in the middle. You know, I would argue that there clearly should be an inclusive approach to managing and coaching in the GAA. But of course, there needs to be elements of exclusivity, because we need to make sure that we are actually providing the challenges and opportunities for the top performers, that we actually are bringing them through. But the danger when it becomes too elite and exclusive and focused in terms of what we're looking to do is that it creates challenges for the wider purpose that is about lifelong engagement. You know, so I think it's important to look at those sort of things. So I think, you know, there is a need for differentiation, but there's a need for differentiation also within teams. And then, you know, so talking about that from the organizational sphere, what about it in a GAA sphere? So do some individual players offer exponentially more value than others? Yeah? You know, of course. Of course, every team has a star, and you're fortunate if you can have a few more. But we see it all the time. Does 15 stars mean that you're guaranteed success? No, because it's back to what are the dynamics that need to be created to create a successful team then. You know, so it is about understanding, and this is back to the ideas of definition of talent. If you've got 15 of the exact same caricatures who've got all of the top skills of the game and all of that, but they may not gel together because there is something missing. You know, it was very interesting to listen to Benny Tierney, whether he realised it or not, that he was being talked about in such circles. But, you know, of course he was obviously a high-performing individual, played inter-county at the highest level. But clearly, the players that played with him felt that there was some sort of other key characteristics that he brought. There was a little bit of that. He was a bit of the glue possibly that bound them all together. And this is back to the idea of, you know, there can be people within your club and within your team that actually are really important. They may not be the best quality and the highest performing footballer or hurler or camogie player, but they possess something that has a positive influence on those around them. And I'm going to talk to a little bit about that in terms of the danger that we do overrate our stars, and we also overrate their portability. And I'm going to talk to a little bit about some of the issues in terms of the research that falls around that. So I'm just going to talk into some of the challenges of the idea of focusing on those, of how we focus on stars in an organizational setting, first of all. So here's a very interesting quote here in some research that came out last year about, that was focused on star employees. So the idea of placement on a fast track doesn't speed up their growth as leaders in the organization as it's meant to. Instead, it either pushes them out the door or slows them down, thwarting their development, decreasing their engagement, and hurting their performance. Why? Well, this idea, when you're groomed as a star, we know that a lot of people feel trapped by that status. That essentially they feel that there's such an expectation and fixation on them and on that and keeping that actually they spend a lot of the time in an organizational setting trying to keep up appearances. And what that often, and said that might be okay because there's a strong fixation on maintaining performance, but the problem is they're not necessarily evolving then, because it's less about actually engaging with areas that they might need to develop further, but the focus is more on actually maintaining their status. You know, so they're not necessarily going to engage in real critical evaluation of what they might need to work on, because that would potentially open them up to, oh, you're not a star anymore, you have these weaknesses. And of course that is very much a psychological state of mind. So, and then there's also the danger that stardom and being a star and viewed as a star brings so much pressure that the fun comes out of it. And this is back to the importance of enjoyment. And it's not just for kids that I think that has to be. You know, when we are hearing and increasingly hearing stories about our senior and the players that we come to watch here talking about the enjoyment going out of the game, we do need to look seriously at what we are doing, I suspect. So again, the focus can become on the star as opposed to anything else. And of course, the real danger of this, when we look at it in a GAA sense, and particularly for underage coaching, is the impact that can have on continued participation. So how many people know here of a multitude of players that they viewed as, geez, they were a great minor. And then 4 or 5 years, they're not a great minor anymore, they're not even playing. And again, the criticism of that typically always reflects on the individual, or it's the individual, what they've gone off and they found drink, or whatever they found. We don't actually reflect on what have we done as an association, as coaches, as a club, to potentially avert some of that sort of issues. There's also, I think, another danger that we see from organizational research on star and exclusive performers or high performers is an overemphasis on the individual themselves. So again, success in high performance involves a multitude of aspects. It's not just one ingredient. And again, you're going to particularly pick out some very interesting research has gone on about high-performing star analysts that work in the stock exchange. And we know that, there's been a really long study that's gone on in the States in terms of looking at the idea that star analysts who switched employers experienced an immediate decline in their performance that persisted for at least 5 years after moving. So again, top performer, was taken by another organization, and took them 5 years to get back to that performance level. That issue was particularly pronounced among those stars that moved to a firm that had lesser overall capabilities, and those who moved on their own without team members. And then I think it starts becoming an interesting story, this research, when you start looking at star analysts who moved between firms with equivalent capabilities also exhibited a drop in performance. But the period was less. They managed to get it back within 2 years. But then the really interesting piece that comes is the star analysts that moved to a firm with equivalent capabilities and systems, but moved with their surrounding team from that organization, had no drop-off in performance. And again, it's the idea of, yes, you might have the star performer of the team, but again, it shows the hidden, to some degree, importance of other team members of achieving the performance levels that lets that one person stand out. Because, of course, you have standouts, and that's just the nature of it. But there is other aspects that actually impact on the person achieving that or not. A point that I've touched upon, again, is this danger of the winning at all costs culture. So again, if the focus is winning it first and foremost, and that's short term, you're naturally selecting the biggest, the fastest, the most skillful players at that point in time. But perhaps, a player has not yet grown. They've not yet reached maturity. So clearly 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds have an awful lot of both of those things to start doing. But what about is a better way to look at some of these things? Who has a strong motivation to learn and how we foster that? Who shows a propensity to be coached? Who shows a propensity to actually take things on board and actually make some improvements? So who has a good inclination to actually look at how they can improve? That's a particularly important way of actually looking at this idea of improvement and developing high performers into the future. And it's back to the point then, if we start cutting players at too early a stage, what about those late bloomers that there are so many cases of? And I think it's very interesting, when we look at academies in professional sports now, and it's not really my expertise, but looking at some of the things, it does appear that some of the academy systems, and particularly in the UK soccer clubs, are beginning to actually roll back a little bit from the investment. And why? Because the numbers that are coming through into their full teams are pretty minimal. So again, it's thinking through all of that, in terms of what the impact of that. I think, again, I think there was a really good base, I think, that was put forward last night in terms of a way to look at a broader level at some of these issues that I think does make a lot of sense that needs some further critical discussion around. And the identification challenge is obviously another key point. So again, in an organizational sense, we would be quite critical of the idea of making decisions based on a cross-sectional period, so essentially at one point in time. Because there's so many things that impact at one point in time, so the idea of it needs to be looked over a period of time and longitudinally looking at things. And this brings me back to this idea of, will we do a better job of actually developing our players if coaches within clubs are engaging with one another at a far greater level? So what's the point of that? So how many of you share data, share expertise as a player moves on to the next level? You know, so does the under 12 coach sit down with those that are looking after the under 13 at different points in time and say, this is what we were focusing on for the year, these are some of the improvements, this is what I was trying to do, to get an understanding of what was going on there. And to see, like, do we chart, how do many of us actually truly look at what is being improved? Our players, we back to us, because really we look at it at just a big level. Oh, his performance, he's got better, he's scoring a bit more. But in terms of looking at the key ingredients that make up a strong hurler or footballer, are we really measuring that over time within a club situation? And that doesn't necessarily need to become this big ordeal and a big data gathering exercise. If we even started having some of those conversations with the purpose of you're actually trying to develop year on year, as opposed to, you know, the under 13, under 14, under 15 manager, starting from scratch and trying to understand the team makeup, but getting a more holistic view of what people are looking at. So I think that is important. And, you know, and again, this idea of that past performance is the best indicator of future performance. It's something that's a mantra that we'd have all heard of, but not necessarily, because it depends. But if the future role is much different, then clearly past performance isn't necessarily the best indicator. And that brings me back to that point of, you know, the best player and the best player often, and who's going to be the most successful at under 12, 14, is back to that size and strength can be so powerful. You know, I still remember at Middleton that we'd two twins, as they were called, because they were twins, but they were, you know, they're 6'5" adults, but they seemed to be 6'5" when they were 14. You know, and essentially they were strong and, you know, less complimentary way, big and awkward, but they were so efficient and effective. And you know, again, you're not saying that you don't invest in them, but again, it's back to looking at that focus. What is that focus? And because that they're not necessarily going to be the stars of the future either. You know, the small little person, the small player who hasn't yet reached certain levels of maturity, we should be very and that's back to understanding what are we actually looking at? What are we trying to coach? I just want to put this up, and this isn't a suggested framework for you to look at, but this is a very commonly used framework in organizational life. Some of you may be subject to it at performance appraisal time in your organizations. And this really is just put up there to get across the idea that performance is not the same thing as potential. Because potential is a future-oriented state, and performance is the current scenario. And also to get across this key point, and this is very important, I think, here, is that you can have an employee, which means you can also have a player that is not performing at a particularly high level, but has so much potential to do so. And I think, you know, a key role for you as a coach is to be able to identify those sort of characters. And it's not a case of, you know, it's then working out, well, how do I help draw out that performance? How do I help draw out that potential? We can all talk to the idea of, geez, that person had so much ability, why aren't they using it? And this is back to the idea of needing to look at the different ways and methods how we actually engage with people. Because, you know, I think somebody spoke about the idea of, you know, smashing the hurleys off the table works for a percentage, but it turns off an awful lot of others. So again, it's looking at, you know, the one-size-fits-all approach to coaching and managing and dealing with your employees or with your players doesn't necessarily fit particularly well. So, like, the table here on the left side are some, what I would say, ingredients that I think makes up professional or high-performing sports stars. I'm not getting into the idea of what are the factors fully that makes a good hurler or footballer. There's far more eminently better qualified people here to do that. But these are essentially, I would suspect, is that these are some of the types of factors that essentially will make the top performer. And I think we spend a lot of time, so physicality or height or weight, right, fair enough, we've nothing to do with that. But we spend an awful lot of time on the skill and the physiological aspects. As a course you must do. You have to develop those, and what I would call, in a dimension of potential, they're foundational aspects. You know, you're getting people to have the skill set that requires them to perform, to be strong. So the underlying skill set is very important, the foundational skill. But actually, it's in the sociological and psychological aspects that are extremely important to actually ensuring you get the best out of those physiological and the skill states that they have. So the idea of generating the team, the developing that decision-making that I think is so, so crucial. You know, developing and supporting the idea that you want to support intuition and creativity, but it's within a particular system or structure and so forth. So looking at that sort of idea. And again, you know, the idea that these, I think, is a very useful way to look at potential in organizational research is something that we're still not very knowledgeable about in terms of how do you measure potential? What are the aspects that you look at? This is one of the better, I think, frameworks that are coming in terms of looking at it in the context of 3 dimensions. So again, as I said, the state of parts. But these, again, are regarded as the most important aspects of actually future potential and talent is motivation to learn. You know? And you think about that, think about it in a work setting, and if you're managing people, that motivation and willingness to learn and that drive to be better themselves is what is so important. If you don't have that, you have very little that you can work with. So about fostering that idea is what is really, really important in realizing somebody to achieve their full potential. So I think, you know, that softer skills dimension is so, so important. In my area of HR research, one of the biggest areas that we look at is the impact of HR practices and HR systems on organizational performance. And one of the most popular frameworks and long-standing frameworks is this idea of the AMO framework. And essentially this is the idea is that people perform better when these 3 conditions are in place. So first of all, that the person possesses the necessary knowledge and skills. So again, back to the key skills of the game and understanding, well, what are the skills that we're trying to develop? And there's so many brilliant resources that the GAA now offer around those sort of things. I think that level of technical coaching has got so much better, I think, since I was playing the game. They want to do the job and are adequately incentivized. So this idea of motivation to perform, motivation to learn, and the final point, very importantly, their work environment provides the necessary support and avenues to progress. So the importance of opportunities to play. And I think that goes very much to Mickey Whelan's point, you know, in terms of the opportunity to put things into practice and changing into games-based scenarios and altering things. And, you know, the importance of touches. You know, it isn't fun to be there on a cold night and you're there waiting in line to get a touch of a ball. We should obviously be looking at scenarios that people are actually getting to employ their skills and practice their skills as much as possible. And I think some very recent emerging evidence that is coming out, which I think is, and probably something that we always thought might have existed, is that the idea is that some of these can be countered. So we know that higher levels of motivation in a work setting can compensate for lower levels of ability, and vice versa. And that brings back to that, you know, mantra of if talent, you know, you can be all the talent in the world, but if you're not going to put the work in, it doesn't matter. But so there is that evidence about the importance of that. I think, you know, to further emphasize that, if you're going on a training course at your organization, that training is of futile benefit unless you were able to put that into practice, and that you're able to put it into practice in a safe environment. So again, if you're asking players to try something different, you have to expect them to fail. And that can't become a big stick that you beat them with then if they fail. You know, so if you're trying to get a player to work on their weaker side, you may sacrifice a game or a short-term game and say, I want you hurling off that side. There may be balls that will go astray, but in the longer-term perspective, they're developing that skill to a better level. Getting close to almost finishing up now. And you know, key point again is this idea of the future-oriented state. So tomorrow may require a plan that is different to today. I think that is really important. You know, so the danger of putting all your eggs into one basket. So this is back to this idea of too much emphasis on structures and systems. So like, you know, without wanting to get into the sweeper system of the game, but like the sweeper system has come about through an evolution. The sweeper system will not be there forevermore because somebody will counteract that and they'll find another way. And again, it's back to the idea of what are you trying to actually coach and learn to make people adaptable and agile. So I guess just some of the key takeaways for today is the idea of understanding that there is a bigger picture than the here and the now and the winning, particularly I think when it comes to underage coaching and development. And I think you need to understand where you fit into that and help your players fit into that. Development is not a short-run game. Development, by its absolute name and inherent meaning, which academics love debating these sort of things, is a future-oriented long-term focus. I suggest that we need to be looking as much as possible, if we're staying true to the mission and values of the GAA, and we want to make sure that it continues to be a key organisation, the social fabric of this country, that we actually live to that mantra of enabling all our members to achieve their full potential. So that when we are looking at, obviously, at developing the next Gooch Cooper, the next Henry Shefflin, Peter Canavan, is that we are not forgetting about that there is a wider purpose to that. So quality coaching needs to be provided to those that are keen to play and want to get better. They may not necessarily make that level, but those key points, they are keen to play and want to get better. It's also important to recognize the star, but be cautious of how we actually engage with that, because the potential for it to actually stunt growth, the potential to create egos and so forth, and that is a fine balancing line, which back to the importance of the relationship. Again, I think a key point of actually recognizing that performance and potential are somewhat different. And the final point, I think, is for you as a coach, is the role of feedback for you, the role of stretching yourself, and the role for learning, and this idea of critical reflection being a conscious practice. I think, obviously, it's maybe preaching to the wrong crowd here at some degree, because you're here looking at a learning form and you'll be reflecting throughout the day as certain things that will resonate with you and certain things that I don't agree with that. But it is that idea of actual building critical reflection into your coaching practice. Thanks very much, and hope you got something out of it.